With this story arc, we finally have the original 5 members of the Straw Hat Pirates, as we're introduced to their new chef, Sanji, who initially, on the surface, has a very similar appeal to Zoro, being a very stoic and serious character, somewhat laid back, and by all accounts seeming to be quite the ladies' man. But when we actually see him talk to a woman, he becomes a bit of a lovesick puppy with heart eyes and everything. It's really quite funny to see the contrast between the two. It's a nice mix of laid back and wacky. In the setting of this story, the Baratier, this sea restaurant, to be really fascinating, especially with its very colourful cast of chefs who are all former pirates, in particular Zeph, the head chef of course, and his very unhealthy relationship with Sanji, initially starting off as enemies, as a pirate captain boarding Sanji's ship when he was young, only for the two of them to be the only survivors of a disaster, and the two are forced to survive thanks to each other and almost starve to death, which gives them this inspiration to create the Baratier, to ensure that no one else goes through that pain that they went through. It's interesting to see these very tough, masculine characters refusing to be more open about their feelings and trying to encourage Sanji to become a chef and go out on his own. Instead, they choose to insult each other and don't really know how to open up. And it's only thanks to someone like Luffy and his speak his mind attitude that he finally gets the crew of the Baratier to admit their feelings, and seeing that character arc is quite compelling. While the focus on Sanji and the Baratier crew does mean that our leads do somewhat kind of get forgotten again, with the exception of Luffy, and even then it's kind of accidentally getting him involved as he almost destroys the ship and kills Zeph, so is somewhat indebted to them. I do appreciate that they don't just have the rest of the crew awkwardly hanging around, instead taking this opportunity to naturally write them out by setting up the next story with Nami suspiciously stealing the Going Mary for no discernible reason, though it has something to do with one of the bounty hunters' wanted posters for a specific pirate, and having Usopp and Zoro go after her is a good way to write them out, in my opinion. And I think the setting of the Baratier does allow for a degree of stake when it comes to the conflict, as being on a boat means that it foreshadows the possibility of Luffy ending up drowning. This is the first instance we get to see the consequence of his devil fruit powers being at risk in this kind of location, and we ultimately get to see that pay off in the next storyline, so this is a good bit of setup for that. In my opinion, the weakest aspect of this storyline is the main villain, Don Krieg. I find him just quite boring, and the only reason he serves as a threat is because of his really strong armor. He's really contrasted with far more interesting characters, especially his second-in-command, Geen, who goes through his own little character journey, being caught between his loyalty to his captain and forming a genuine friendship with Sanji. It's a much more compelling storyline, and it doesn't help that midway through the story, the greatest swordsman Hawkeye Mihawk shows up and is just oozing with mystery and charisma, and forms a far more interesting dynamic with Luffy and especially Zoro, just effortlessly. The fact that he decimates Zoro without even trying and encourages him to a rematch to get him to prove himself. And I will concede that once we get to the fight sequence of this storyline, this is where I noticed the very awkward staging of the fights, where we have these two massive groups, the Baratier chefs and Don Krieg's crew, just awkwardly standing around or swimming around in the water while there are one-on-one battles going on. And especially given that Don Krieg isn't that interesting of a character, it just leaves it kind of awkward. I'm hoping that as the budget increases, we're able to more effectively show these large battles